Hi, boys and girls. The first book we're going to read is a biography about Ruby Bridges. And this is a picture of Ruby right here. And she was a very important person, even though she was just a little girl. She was a very important person in the fight against segregation. So, let's see, read a little bit about Ruby. This is Ruby all grown up. Ruby Bridges became famous. Meet Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges became famous when she was only 6 years old. She was the first African American student to go to an all-white school in Louisiana. Ruby was born on September 8, 1954, in Tylertown, Mississippi. She had 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. Her family moved to New Orleans, Louisiana, when Ruby was 4. So here's where she was born, in Mississippi and Tylertown, and there is New Orleans. At the time, African American people were treated unfairly in many parts of the country. Segregation laws kept black people and white people separate. Things that were meant for black people were not as good as those that white people used, but things were about to change. It says this photo shows children in a school for African American kids. In 1954, a new law said that schools had to integrate. That meant that black children must be allowed to attend white schools. Many white people in the South hated the idea of their children sharing a classroom with black children. It says many white people tried to fight against integration. A brave young girl. Ruby was chosen to integrate William Franz Elementary School in New Orleans. She would be the only African American in the school. The white parents were very angry. They were ready to do what they could to stop Ruby from coming. I mean, she's a 6-year-old girl. Goodness. Ruby started first grade on November 14, 1960. Angry protesters were waiting outside the school when she arrived. Federal marshals had to protect Ruby and her mom as they entered the school. It says, fast fact, white parents chanted 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate, and they threw things at Ruby and her mother. There's Ruby walking into the school. Once inside the school, Ruby and her mother were taken to the principal's office. They waited there all day. They saw white parents take their children home. The parents chose to keep their kids out of school rather than have them be there with a black child. That's horrible. This says, we the poor white people and our children demand our rights, freedom of association. On her second day of school, Ruby faced the same screaming parents outside her school. Inside, her new teacher, Barbara Henry, greeted Ruby with a hug. Ruby was Mrs. Henry's only student. There were no other kids in the class. Mrs. Henry later posed in the classroom she shared with Ruby. A hard year. Ruby was the only student in her class all year. It was not safe for her to eat in the lunchroom or to play outside at recess. Ruby became very lonely. Mrs. Henry ate lunch with her student and tried to make class fun. The next year, there were more black kids at Ruby's school. The protesters were gone, but so was Mrs. Henry. Ruby always wondered what happened to her teacher. It says, as time passed, white children returned to school. Ruby grows up. This is Mrs. Henry. When she grew up, Ruby married Malcolm Hall and had a family of her own. In 1995, she reunited with her favorite teacher, Mrs. Henry. They hugged each other like they used to every morning in first grade. Aww. In 1999, Ruby wrote a book about her life called Through My Eyes. She also started the Ruby Bridges Foundation. The foundation helps parents and schools work together to end racism. It says Ruby's book tells about her experience in her own words. The book is called Through My Eyes. Ruby Bridges was a brave little girl who grew into an amazing woman. Her courage helped bring about important change in the United States, and her story continues to inspire people today. Here's a timeline of her life. She was born in 1954. 1960, she started first grade. In 1984, she got married. In 1995, she reunited with her teacher, Mrs. Henry. And in 1999, she started the Ruby Bridges Foundation. And this is a poem about Ruby Bridges. Black children in elementary school, 0. Then 6-year-old Ruby became a young hero. She bravely faced terrible taunting each day, till little by little the world turned her way. And it says, you can be courageous. Do not let the actions or opinions of others affect how you think of yourself. If someone is treating you unfairly, speak up. We talk about a lot about that in Bamford. Do not give up on something you believe in, even if others try to stop you. The end. All right, guys. I hope you liked that and you learned a little bit more about Ruby Bridges.